This is Canessa EO, and today we will discuss monopoly and competition. Recall that Adam Smith came up with the concept of the invisible hand. The concept is relatively simple. It basically illustrates the fact that when competitive markets are widely available, then individuals within those markets can pursue their own self-interest, and as a result of this pursuit, they can benefit the common good. We can illustrate the concept of the invisible hand through the invisible hand game. We have our players here, Anil and Bala. Both players have a dominant strategy. Anil always plants cassava, and Bala always plants rice. Given that both players have their own dominant strategy, we have the Nash equilibrium of cassava and rice. The Nash equilibrium, by definition, implies that no individual has an incentive to change their strategy or behavior in this game. And we can also see that the equilibrium is efficient. So contrary to our prisoner's dilemma games that we learned in 1.4, recall that outcome is inefficient because both players can be better off. In this case, our outcome is efficient. There's no other payoffs in which either of our players could benefit with the higher payoffs. So we say that this is an efficient outcome. We could see that Anil can trade some cassava to Bala for some rice, or vice versa. And it's technically impossible to make one person better off without making another individual worse off. So our outcome, our Nash equilibrium, is cassava and rice, and this equilibrium is also Pareto efficient. Moving to some historical context for monopoly and competition, we have Léon Walras, the founder of the neoclassical school of economics, and he helped formalize economics. Prior to this, a lot of the political economics in the classical era broke down a lot of the concepts, but did not have any mathematical derivations to prove some of their theories. Walras developed a lot of these and came up with the concept of general equilibrium, in which our supply will equal demand, and this will be the case across all markets. And his model provides the basis of the more recent invisible hand theorem. So, given that this is the case, we have our general equilibrium, which is Pareto efficient, and this only occurs when markets are perfectly competitive. Illustrating the difference between price setting and price taking firms, we can think about our two analyses in Unit 7 and Unit 8. In Unit 7, we talked about monopolies. If you take a look at the graph on our left, we have a downward sloping demand curve, and we can see that following from the price at point A, we can see that we create dead weight loss in a monopolistic market. And given that this is the case, we have dead weight loss, which means we're not maximizing our total surplus, and so this is inefficient. On our graph on the right, we have a flat demand curve, and so in this case, our market for bread is perfectly competitive, and given that this is the case, we are maximizing our total economic surplus, and therefore we can say that this is efficient. So following from our last slide, we know that perfectly competitive firms will lead to efficient outcomes, and this is because our total economic surplus is maximized. The monopolistic equilibrium is inefficient because we are not maximizing the total surplus, and think about things that help us identify this are instruments like dead weight loss and so forth. In 2.4, this is your homework on monopolistic firms. We had the iWidgets who were trying to maximize profits. They set a price at $1,000. They were selling a quantity of 10 units, and they were making $8,000 in economic profit. Consumer surplus was $4,500. That's our red triangle here. And we had a dead weight loss of $4,500. And this is illustrated by our orange triangle on the right. So in this case, in 2.4, you had the example of a monopolistic market that led to an inefficient outcome. In this case, it's technically possible to make someone better off. So in our invisible hand game, our result is efficient and we cannot make anyone better off. However, if we have a monopolistic market, then we could potentially have room for a Pareto improvement. It's still difficult though. There are a number of different policy discussions and stuff that need to be put in place prior to implementing something that will result in a Pareto improvement. We've looked at a perfectly competitive market in a couple different examples. It'll help to illustrate it verbally. So in this case, a perfectly competitive market is one in which buyers and sellers are price takers. And for a market to be perfectly competitive, it has to have a couple different features. The first being that there must be many buyers and there has to be many sellers as well. We can't have one firm selling a single product. There have to be a large number of different firms and so forth that are selling the same product. The product must also be homogeneous, so we can't be able to differentiate from one seller to another. For example, in monopolistically competitive markets, we have things like McDonald's and Wendy's, and there are arguments about these firms which tells you that the product is not homogeneous. And the buyers and sellers must know the market price. So everyone sort of receives these signals and they set the price according to what the market price is being generated. In a perfectly competitive market, a couple different things happen. All transactions occur at a single price, and at that price, the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded, and the market clears. So this fits with Walras's general equilibrium theory. In a perfectly competitive market, supply will equal demand. Another way to think about this concept is just to illustrate it as markets clearing. In your homework this week, you will be covering an example of a perfectly competitive market and thinking about this in the context of a pizza firm. And remember, in a perfectly competitive market, no buyer or seller has the ability to change the market price, and all potential gains from all trades are realized. This is the intuition behind perfectly competitive markets, maximizing economic surplus. The soybean market is one that is a very close example of a perfectly competitive market. You can think about it whenever you purchase these things, you're not differentiating soybeans across different firms and so forth, and the producers have no ability to alter the price. Whatever the going price is, they are subject to that market price. Now we can juxtapose the theory behind these two types of firms. The model of perfect competition describes an idealized market structure. This is what we would all like markets to be. This would help to maximize total economic surplus, so both consumers and producers would benefit from having this idealized market structure. And even if some conditions for perfect competition are not met, there may be enough competition to assume firms are price takers. So there are instances where maybe we could differentiate a little bit between different firms and so forth, but those firms still have no price making or price setting power. And the model of supply and demand can be useful for understanding markets of somewhat differentiated products. And so these are examples like I illustrated before, like monopolistically competitive markets for things like McDonald's and Wendy's. Also think of things like Nike and Adidas and so forth. A couple other examples like the one on our right here to illustrate this. Think about whether you feel that the market for headphones is perfectly competitive, or think about it in the context of maybe a single firm like Panasonic. Are they a price setter or a price taker? There's a couple different things to illustrate here. You can look at the different specs for different headphones, and these products are sort of differentiated by different elements that they provide. And you can think about this in the context of other firms. Are other firms, or do they have the ability to price set and so forth? And the other thing is, think about Amazon as a price setter or a price taker. This is a very general concept, but does Amazon have the ability to set prices, or are they just subject to the going price? If you're interested further in some of these questions, I would encourage you to check out Hassan Minhaj's episode of the Patriot Act on Amazon. He illustrates a lot of different examples and contextualizes Amazon within this sort of framework. Another quick example here of one that's not exactly a perfectly competitive market is the market for Choccos and chocolate bars. Many chocolate bars are very close substitutes for Choccos. So some individuals have very slight preferences for different chocolate bars, but a lot of them are relatively similar. This intense competition means that Choccos has very little market power. They have very little price setting power. And so in this case, the demand curve is relatively flat. We could also illustrate this by saying the demand curve is very elastic, and it can barely raise the price by constraining production in this case. So it can't restrict the quantity of output as severely as a monopolistic firm could. Following from this, we can see that a firm of this case in which they're relatively perfectly competitive will choose a price that's very close or approximately equal to the marginal cost. And so we can see this illustrated in our graph on the left here. And all the other firms will follow a similar suit. And the market supply curve in this case will be equal to the horizontal summation of every individual firm's marginal cost curves. And as a result of taking the summation of all these marginal cost curves, we can illustrate the market the market supply curve for chocolate bars. And then from there, we can define our market demand curve as well. We did a similar example if you return to our last lecture where we talked about the Danish tax on butter. So economists rely heavily on two different tests to identify competitive equilibrium. The first is to ask the question, do firms sell goods at a price that is equal to marginal cost? And the second being, do all trades take place at the same price? I would strongly encourage you to look up this example in 8.9 of your textbook. But this graph on the left illustrates the context of banking in the 1980s. We can see that the cost of funds, which is the opportunity costs that banks face for loaning out money, falls from about 15% all the way down to 7% in this case. But we can see that the price for credit card loans is essentially unchanged throughout this process. And then thinking about another example or another way to assess within the context of looking at trades taking place at the same price is the example of The Hobbit, relatively famous film, and you can look at the price from a number of different products. And so I'm sure some of you have done this sort of on your own when shopping for shoes or something. You've looked at the price from the retailer's website and then went across to Amazon and so forth and found that the product was sold at a different price from a lot of different firms. So now thinking about competition in the context of firm behavior, we know that few firms are monopolists and very few firms are perfectly competitive as well. Most of our firms fall in the middle of that spectrum. Real-world economies have both more and less competitive markets. And we can see the case where both price setters and price takers are similar in what they have to decide. They all decide how much to produce. They all decide which technologies to use. They all decide how many people to hire and how much to pay their individual workers. When we differentiate between competitive markets and monopolists, we can think of them as price setters. Price setters are much more likely to advertise. So you can think about different contexts like Nike, Adidas, and so forth. Think about Apple and Microsoft. Moving from that, they're also more likely to lobby, so push for different legislation. So we think about the context of Uber. In California, they simply recently voted on a Lyft tax and so forth, and invest in research and development. So most perfectly competitive firms do not have the funds to sort of pursue any of these different alternatives. I'm not going to walk all the way through figure 820. But I would encourage you to look through this in your textbook or go through it in these slides and sort of identify different elements for yourself. Essentially, this provides sort of a taxonomy between two different types of firms, a monopoly and a perfectly competitive market. Thinking about the first unit here, where the monopolistic firms can set prices and quantities to maximize their profits, and we can juxtapose that with a perfectly competitive market in which they take the market determined prices given and they choose their quantity from there to maximize their profits. And so go through this sort of taxonomy here and identify the different elements for yourself. Thinking about monopolization in the context of inequality, we know that big businesses overcharge U.S. citizens about $5,000 a year for different products. And we can think about this compared to Europe. The U.S. has experienced a couple different things. Increased monopolization. So this is a function of a number of different things, some firms gaining market power, and simultaneously the United States sort of relaxing on antitrust laws, so allowing for more and more firms to merge. Given that firms are allowed to merge, they gain market power, they are now allowed to set prices, and so we see increased prices in the US as well. And over the last 2 decades, we've seen a couple different things. Fewer corporations. This is a result of more firms merging together. If any of you were maybe Sprint owners, or you purchased products from Sprint a couple of years ago, you now know that is now sort of subsumed into T-Mobile's entity. We see more mergers in this case in the United States, and a smaller labor share. So looking at the graph on the right, we can see the share of economy going to worker pay. Europe sees a much larger share of their economy going to workers relative to the United States. And these empirical facts fit with our model in this case.